I speak a lot. I speak everywhere. I speak at universities. I speak overseas. I was just in Pakistan not too long ago. And no matter where I speak, no matter how big or small the crowd, I'm always honored because of several reasons. One, and I'm not going to go through my backstory, but a person that comes from where I come from, many of my peers, they did not make it. Um, Gang violence got them, drugs got them, but I'm blessed to still be here. And so I'm just honored that I'm able to share a little bit with y'all today. Um, and I'm really honored to be here as we gather together to celebrate Juneteenth, right? It's freedom that was delayed here in Texas 2.5 years, but it could not be denied. Today we commemorate a day where those in Texas finally tasted the blessing of having ownership over their own bodies for the first time in almost 250 years. Now, this day has been called many things. It's been called Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, Black Independence Day, Jubilee Day, but obviously today we're calling it Juneteenth, right? And I assume most of us know about Juneteenth, so I don't need to go through a whole history lesson. And I think we all know what happened, right? By now, I think we're fully aware that, as I just said, the enslaved remained in captivity for 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by then President Abraham Lincoln, right? I think most of us are also aware that this came into being because an Army general by the name of Gordon Granger came to Galveston with 6,000 Union soldiers. 4,000 of those soldiers were black, by the way, to enforce this order, right? This order of freedom. And with these words, the people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, that all slaves are free. Those are the words that Gordon Granger read when he got to Galveston. And those are the very words that actually released us, right, and dropped the chains of bondage, again, that we have been in for 250 years. Now, we're here celebrating it, but you can imagine what it meant, actually, right, to have been enslaved your entire life. Actually, there were 4 generations of people who never knew what freedom was. They had never had ownership over their bodies, right? They had never had the opportunity to live as free people. And so it was a glorious day for them, right? It was a day of singing, it was a day of rejoicing. It was a day that these individuals, as I said, our ancestors, they've been praying for this since 1619 when the first of them were forcibly brought to these shores. And I wanted to say that, I wanted to talk about how this is a celebration and how we must commemorate, because what I'm about to say, I don't want that to take away the significance of this event that we're at, right? There is significance in this new freedom that they had, right? There's a significance in this foundation that our ancestors laid for us, which is, again, the reason why we're all here today. But I want to say something about the celebration, and that is if we stop at the celebration, then actually we diminish what our ancestors had to endure to get here, right? Because although, right, we are here to celebrate and they tasted freedom and had agency over their own bodies, right? They didn't just like go out and like, hey, I'm just gonna leisurely lay around and all of a sudden I can do what I wanna do. They actually got to work. They had no choice but to get to work. And I think on this day, the one thing that we have to remember is although we are celebrating, this day should actually make all of us want to get to work. And I want to tell you why, right? So after these enslaved people were emancipated, they went into what we know as freedmen's towns, right? So in Texas, there were over 500 freedmen's towns, right? From Houston to Denton, to Austin, here in Buda, right? Everywhere in between, right? The formerly enslaved people arrived to these barren lands, right? And they transformed them into utopias where they could experience this absolute freedom that General Granger talked about when he read General Order Number 3. Right? In these free spaces, they built schools, they built churches, right? They built community centers. If there was anything that they needed that didn't exist, and remember, there wasn't a lot that existed for them at all, but if they needed it, they created it, right? Black men were allowed to vote for the first time, right? Run for public office, serve in Congress. All of this is happening during Reconstruction, right? We created newspapers, theaters, nightclubs, right? We created it all. We created whole communities out of nothing, right? But we also know that with this forward movement came major backlash, right? So the KKK was formed on December 24th, 1865, just 5 months after June 19th, 1865, right? So in response to this new freedom came this white terrorist group that wanted to squash this freedom that these individuals had finally attained, right? Lynchings went up, whole black communities were terrorized, destroyed, burned to the ground, leaving a lot of our people wondering if this freedom, right, that they've been told about would ever be fully realized. And that led to another revelation that I think our people had. And Angela Davis captures this so well when she says, freedom is a constant struggle, right? And I say this because I think it's important for us to understand that this battle for absolute freedom, right, which is in the proclamation that is read in the Order Number 3, that this battle is actually still being waged today, right? And yeah, like I said, I know we're here to celebrate Juneteenth and we're holding space with each other in tribute to emancipation. And again, I think that's very important. But I almost wonder if this day is actually less about the celebration and more about picking up the baton that these individuals actually had stolen from them as they tried to go out and build these new lives. Now, what do I mean by that, right? Well, like I said, we have the right to vote, and we still have the right to vote, but you even see today that our lawmakers are trying to undo that, right? And we find ourselves lobbying to have the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act put into place, right? Right now, we can attend any university we want to, we can go to any college we want to go to, yet institutions of higher education are still predominantly white, and we know that. We can live wherever we want to live, right? Yet, because of exclusionary and frankly racist housing practices, the good majority of us still don't actually have the resources to own our own homes. We can't get the loans, right? And then black ownership is on the rise, right? Black business ownership is on the rise. But we still have a long way to go to actually come close to the amount of businesses that are owned by our white counterparts, right? We are still incarcerated at a higher rate than anyone else. Still more likely to be killed by the cops. The schools in our neighborhoods are still severely underfunded. And speaking of our neighborhoods, quite frankly, those are being stolen from underneath us right now as I stand here and talk to you, right? Now again, I want to keep reiterating this. We are here to celebrate, right? So I hope that me saying these things didn't bring the room down, didn't stopping you from eating your turkey leg if there's one around here. But I just wouldn't be myself if I didn't remind us that to rejoice and not continue fighting for liberation will lead to our ultimate destruction, right? Now, the question that I was asking myself as I was writing this is, what does true liberation or freedom really even look like, right? What do we have to do in order to attain this liberation or this freedom, this absolute freedom that was talked about in General Order Number 3? And I came up with a list, right? But this is by no means everything that I think we need to do, but there's a few things that I think we should be thinking about, right? The first is that we need to look back in order to move forward, right? Right now in Texas and really around the country, there is a vehement attack on history and on truth, right? And so we have to ensure that the stories of our people, our ancestors, those again emancipated on June 19th, 1865, that those stories don't disappear, right? That the struggles they endured are documented, right? Because their ability to overcome those struggles and us studying those stories can actually be the roadmap we need to fight the present struggles that we face, right? I think a lot of times we think we have to start from scratch when it comes to fighting for freedom. But guess what? They did it. And if we would study them, if we would read more about them, if we would actually exhume their narratives and exhume the blueprint that they created for us, we actually have the strategies that we need to attain this freedom. We just got to go look for it, right? Secondly, I think we need to remind our children that their story did not begin on slave plantations. I want to say that again. We need to remind our children that their story did not begin on slave plantations, right? It's so important that we remind our children that, but also that we remind ourselves, because I think sometimes we even forget, right? That we come from a land that is rich with resources. This is a land that is still, and I'm talking about the continent of Africa, still being colonized to this day because of the natural resources that are on it, right? And we descended from that, right? It's in our DNA, right? We literally come from the place where the first humans walked the earth, right? Which means that these humans invented science, math, architecture, medicine, educational institutions, you name it, and we had it, right? Now, I know we've been told that the Romans invented that, or the Greeks invented that, but that's not real history. The real history is that majority of those things were invented on the continent of Africa. And just go look at a pyramid and you'll see what I'm talking about, right? The next thing we need to remember, this may be a little bit controversial, but it's okay. Our religious institutions need to be more than places where we worship God, but they need to center the gospel as a foundation to strategize community development, educational advancements, money management, and everything that we need to be successful. What do I mean by that? If all we're doing is going to church every Sunday, and I'm in church every Sunday, but if all we're doing there is just hearing a sermon, reading out of the Bible, but we're not strategizing how we're actually going to rebuild our communities, then I would say that we need to reevaluate why we're going into those spaces, right? Right? The black church, you gotta remember this, right? As it was during the civil rights movement, right? It was a central figure of movement during the civil rights movement, a central figure of progress during the civil rights movement, right? And I know we love to quote, MLK's I Have a Dream speech, but I want to quote something else he said, right? And he said, the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. So even when MLK was speaking this is in 65, when he says this, he already knows that the church's influence and impact is starting to dwindle because it has stopped living up to its true mission, right? And so if you're a pastor out here, I'm sure there's some out here, I would hope again that we begin to make our religious institutions a place where we can help build community. The fourth thing I want to say is, I think we as black people, talking to people now, right? We got to get on one accord with what true emancipation really looks like, right? I think the biggest strategy that our oppressors use, and it's a strategy that's been working since we arrived on these shores, and that's the strategy of dividing and conquering, right? They understand, right, that a team that refuses to play nice with each other, refuses to let their teammates shine at some point, refuses to talk to each other and hold space with each other, that team is powerless, and that they will never be able to collectively figure out what freedom looks like, right? I think the problem is, right, we sometimes don't understand that we have to stick together. Sometimes we don't speak to each other, right? We believe that we're out to get one another. We're only concerned about our children and no one else's children. And we gotta stop that, because the road to our progress is in our ability to hold each other accountable, to work with each other, and for us to get on the same page, right? The fifth thing I want to say, and this is important, right? We gotta vote, right? And not only vote, but when we vote, and if the individuals that we campaign for and we voted for, if they end up in office, we also have to hold those individuals accountable, right? Right, like I said, first and foremost, we gotta show up to polls, right? We can't complain about policy if we've not worked to put people in office who align with our ideals and who will fight for our most pressing needs. But again, we gotta put those individuals in office to work, and we must demand that they live up to the promises that they made to us when they were campaigning, right? Now, I know many of us, right, have been disappointed, right, when politicians campaign on promises that they don't keep, or they develop what I'm calling political amnesia, right? And I too have found myself upset when the very people I voted for don't live up to those promises. But we can't get discouraged. And we need to put a demand on those politicians by calling, writing, showing them to their offices, and really forcing them to do what they said they were gonna do for our community, right? Now the sixth thing I wanna say, and I'm talking to my white brothers and sisters out here, right? We don't simply need you all to be allies with us. We need you to be co-conspirators in this struggle, right? It's not enough to support me, to say that you understand my pain, or to simply march alongside me, right? It's vital that you too put a demand on our government when it comes to issues of social justice and equity, right? It's important that you be willing to sacrifice your comforts, to give up your status, and regardless of the consequences, be willing to challenge anyone who stands in the way of progress, right? And then lastly, I told you I had 7 of these, I just want to say that it takes all of us to do this together, right? Freedom is a collective struggle, right? Because bondage is actually a communal atrocity, right? Not only did I suffer during slavery, or my ancestors, suffered during slavery, but also the ones who were actually doing the harm to me suffered, because they suffered psychologically. To believe that you are better than another person means you have a psychosis, right? And it's something that you have to deal with, right? And so when I'm in bondage, none of us are actually free, right? And so it's important that we get together, right? And Nelson Mandela said this best. He said, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others," right? Which goes back to what I said, we all have to do this together, right? And as I said, it doesn't always look like it, but when any one of us is in chains, we are all in chains, right? Now, as I come to the end of my remarks, I reflect on the name of this celebration, right? And I see some of these shirts out here. Free-ish, right? Free-ish. Right? I'm gonna say it again, free-ish, right? And it's such an interesting phrase because, in my opinion, it captures the dichotomy of Juneteenth, right? We are indeed free, right? We have indeed made so much progress. We've come so far in so many spaces and been allowed to operate in ways that our ancestors could have only hoped for, right? And it's their hopes and prayers that have brought us to this place, right? So I'm literally standing on the shoulders of those who were emancipated. on June 19th, 1865, right? I'm living in the freedom that they cried out to God for. But on the other hand, we still have a long ways to go, right? So just a few weeks ago, a young black mother in Florida was shot to death by her neighbor for walking onto her porch. The white woman who killed her is finally arrested, but she's only arrested because of the outcry of the community. Not actually because of the crime, because if it was because of the crime, they would have arrested her when they picked up this woman's body, but she stayed at her house for a while, right? A Starbucks employee, I don't know if y'all remember this, who facilitated the arrest of 2 black men a few years ago because they looked suspicious, she was fired, right? But guess what just happened a few days ago? Starbucks has to pay this woman over $25 million in restitution because they said that she was only fired not because she called the cops, not because she had these young men falsely arrested, but she was only fired because she was white, right? So I'm gonna call out a few things, right? And y'all may know these things. If you don't, I want you to research them. Tulsa, Trayvon Martin, Tyler Perry, right? Wilmington, look it up, Sandra Bland, Oprah Winfrey, free-ish. Buffalo, New York, a G.K. Owens, the woman who was just murdered in Florida. Stacey Abrams, right? Black Wall Street, burned to the ground. Toni Morrison, one of the greatest authors of all time. Camp Logan, look up the Houston riots of 1917. Barack Obama, right? And the reason I call these names and these places back to back is because, again, they represent the dichotomy and the complexity of Juneteenth. That on one hand, we have attained freedom, but on the other hand, we are actually still fighting to attain that absolute freedom that was promised to us on June 19th, 1865. Thank y'all so much. It was my pleasure.
Come on, y'all, let's do it. Y'all can do that. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Y'all see our future in the making. Thank you.